If you're taking AP World History, you've joined the right place. I've got Emily Glankler from Antisocial Studies. I'm John from Marco Learning. Emily, you and I just had a fight online, and I would like to describe the details of the conflict, talk about how you and I are still friends, but we have some challenges to overcome. So recently, Emily wrote a DBQ on live on her channel. And I'm going to share my screen and show you guys something really cool. So this is her channel. I'm going to put the link in the description. This is Antisocial Studies, an amazing channel. And here's Emily in front of a psychedelic blue background of ink in water, writing a DBQ that then I grade on the Marco Learning channel. So definitely check out Antisocial Studies. I'm going to put the link in the description in the chat. I'm also going to plug our really cool free resource, the AP World History Study Guide Pack. And this study guide pack, I'm going to just show you this. We've updated it with all the units for AP World. It is beautiful. Best hat in the history of the world, right there. And we've got images and kind of just at this point in the year, Emily, it's so overwhelming. There's so much to study. The AP exams in a few days. Don't take on everything. Take on this. Take on small things you can handle. So, Emily, what are we going to cover in our session for today?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about how to pace yourself on the AP exam. And so we're going to focus a lot of our time on the multiple choice because I know that's the part that kind of freaks a lot of people out. But I'm also just going to give you some tips on how to just get through the whole test, whether you're doing it a week from Monday or whether you're doing it later in the month or in June. And then I also do want to mention, those study guides are amazing because I've had a lot of people DMing me like, I haven't started studying at all. Where should I start? And I'm like, well, start with those because those will give you the big idea. And then, we'll repair our relationship from you saying that my writing was, quote, not a work of art. But
Well, was it? I mean,
it was kind of, it was, you retracted it later, but
no.
I had to pick out that one statement because I thought it was just too funny to miss. No big deal. I ended up getting a perfect score on the DBQ.
Yeah, I know, right? That's so much for all of my complaining. And I think that was it's fun to do it live, what you did on your channel. Go through a DBQ and just feel that. If you have not practiced yet with a full-length DBQ under duress, do it and go through that experience and then look at yourself in the mirror and say, what did I do well? What were those shortcuts I took? So Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome to everyone who's joined. If you're watching the recording of this, post your questions in the comments. If you're watching it live, say hello in the chat and definitely subscribe to our channel. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Okay. Hey everybody. I just figured we could think about pacing the test. So I thought this could be really helpful for a few reasons. One is that it's a good way to just remind ourselves like, okay, what is the test, right? What does it look like? Which hopefully you know by now, but if not, you should kind of commit this part a little bit to memory so that you're not surprised on the day of the test. And also, it'll be a good way to kind of review some of the different strategies that we've been giving y'all over the last few months. And like how to now, we're in full test prep mode, right? So up until this point, right, there's a lot of things where I'm like, well, in an ideal world, you want to do this and this. No, like we're fully in test prep mode. We are on strategy only. We are just wanting to like do what we need to do to get the points we deserve on the test. Beautiful writing is out the window. It's not a work of art, as John would say. We just got to get the points. So I kind of want to go section by section and basically give you my tips on how to pace yourself appropriately and then hopefully answer your questions. So I'm going to start with the multiple choice. So if you have questions about the multiple choice section in any way, put them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them. But no matter whether you're taking the paper or the digital test, this is the exact same. You're going to have 55 questions in 55 minutes. There's one big difference about whether you can go back and forth, and we'll talk about that in a second. I want to remind y'all, I've said this in previous videos, but I just want to remind you that like on the multiple choice, you are not shooting for perfection. And so on the multiple choice, this hurts my heart to say it, but it's about quantity over quality. Oh, I hate saying that, but, and hey, Maya, you're totally right. This will help if you're doing APUSH or AP Euro as well. All of these tests are formatted the same. So the content I'm going to use to show these things is different, but welcome in if you're US or Euro. So on the multiple choice, it's quantity over quality. What that means is that it's better to get through and have a guess on all 55 questions, even if you have to go kind of quickly through some of them. That is better than getting through like 40 of them and feeling really confident. It's better to try to just answer all of them, even if that means some of them you might get wrong because you went a little quickly. Okay. So Here's my approach to the multiple choice in one slide, right? My approach is generally you should read the question first, not necessarily all the answer choices, but at least look at the question first before you dive into the document, especially if that's a text, because some of the texts that they give you are pretty dense, but you might not actually need most of that information. You might actually only need a little bit. There have been times where you'll have a multiple choice question that you can answer without even reading the text, or that you get all the information you need just from the sourcing information at the bottom. So I always suggest that you at least skim the question you're gonna have to answer first, because a lot of times that'll give you some clues of like, okay, now I just need to go skim the document to find whenever they talk about this thing. Sometimes they'll even be nice enough to say, the blah, blah, blah described in paragraph 2, and that's great. That means you skim paragraph 1 and then you really read paragraph 2 closely. Cami, as far as we can tell, yes, the multiple choice generally go in chronological order. That's for sure on the paper test. We're all assuming that's the same on the digital test as well. So then you go and you skim the stimulus for whatever the question is asking you about, right? So if it's asking you about like the tone of a passage, then just skim for words that relate to that. Or if it's asking you about a specific reference, like the trade described in this, skim until you get to where they're describing trade. Okay. Now, when you're looking at the 4 answer choices, the first step always should be eliminate answers. It's really rare on these AP tests that you see a question, you look at the 4 answer choices, and you're like, boom, I know the right answer. I feel completely confident. Let's move on. That's not how these questions are built, right? There's probably going to be at least 2 that you're like, it could be either of these. So the first step is eliminate ones that you're like, I feel confident this is not the answer. You should eliminate it for one of 2 reasons. Either it's just historically inaccurate. It is just like a false statement. So you could literally start with your 4 just doing like true false. If there is a statement there that is not historically accurate, it cannot be the answer. Unless I guess they're asking you all of the following except. But otherwise, cross that one out. Keep in mind, on the paper test, you can physically cross it out. On the digital test, there's an annotation tool if you want to use it, where you can actually cross it out on there as well. You can also have scratch paper where you can just like be doing this on your own too. You should also eliminate any answer choices that are just totally not relevant. You're like, this might be true, but it has nothing to do with the question I've been asked or the stimulus I've been given. If you're not sure, then leave it, right? This first step of eliminating should be only for ones that you're like, I'm 75% sure or more that this is not the answer, right? If you're not sure, leave it, who knows, right? Then you should hopefully be down to 2 in an ideal world. You might get down to 1. There are times where you have no idea what the answer is, but you eliminate all the ones that are wrong or not relevant. You're like, well, shoot, I'm only left with 1, so I guess it has to be this one. Just trust that process and move on, right? If you're down to 2 or even 3, then you want to really start thinking a little more critically. So you want to think about, like, does this answer the question I'm being asked? One of the most common traps that students fall into is that you'll end up with 2 answer choices that are both correct. Like they're both correct statements about the Ottoman Empire or whatever, but only one of those statements actually answers the question you're being asked. So go back and reread the question and pay attention. If it's asking you like for a change that blah, 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 well, then make sure the thing that's being described is a change. It's not the case that like there's going to be 3 completely wrong answers and 1 perfectly correct answer. There's probably going to be at least 2 that are like, these are both correct statements relating to the Ottoman Empire, but only one of them actually answers the question. Now, if you're still not sure, if you're like, I kind of think they both could answer, well, now think about the stimulus and pick if there's one of the answer choices that's more closely connected to whatever stimulus they gave you. So someone's asking about like if they give you a table, a graph, or whatever, or a map, right? If the map is a map of imperialism and you're down to 2 options and one is about the economy and one is about like military control of colonies, if you're like, well, I'm not really sure, okay, well, they gave me this map showing colonies, so I guess I'm going to pick that one, right? So at this point, right, this is sort of the steps you should go through to answer these questions. And keep in mind, the very first question in your set will take a little bit longer because you're having to skim the stimulus, right? So it's okay if this first step takes a minute or 2. And then, these steps should be fairly quick, right? Now, a lot of people ask, what if I have no idea? Like, what if maybe you can get rid of one, but you're stuck between three or even two, and you're like, I've done all those steps, I still have no idea. I just need to make a guess and move on. Okay, if that is the case, and only if that's the case, if you're like, I need to move on from this question, then from whatever answer choices you have left, pick the answer choice that's the most vague or the most general, right? So if you're stuck between two and one of the answers is something like, the British militarily controlled islands in Southeast Asia versus the British established influence in the Indian Ocean. One of those is way more specific than the other. And so there's more opportunities for it to be wrong, right? If they say things like military control, direct control in this specific part of the world, it's like any of those things, if one of those things is wrong, the whole thing's wrong. So again, if you're just desperate and you're like, I've spent too much time on this question, I need to move on, then pick whichever answer choice that's left is the most broad. Because it's like, well, yeah, that's a pretty general statement. So yeah, it probably could be true in some way, right? Okay, here's the biggest thing. If you're taking the paper test, you have a little bit of an advantage here. I think that the digital testers have an advantage in typing their essays, but we'll talk about that later. So I think the advantage on the paper test is that you will get all 55 questions and you can move around. You can go back and forth. Here's what that means. I still would go in order because, like I think Cami said earlier, like they do go in chronological order. So I would still go in order because that helps your brain. And I would still make a guess with every question before you move on. But if you get to a question where you've spent a minute or two on that question and you're like, I still am not sure, I would mark it, right? You can mark it on a piece of scratch paper. I need to go back and look at question 5 if I have time. But still make a guess. It bums me out. Like every year, what some kids do is they leave those blank, right? A lot of us do that. You skip it. And so you're like, I'm going to skip it and come back to it at the end, and you leave it blank. And then you might run out of time and not have time to go back and bubble. Or if you do, you don't have time to go back and actually look at the question. So you're like, B, 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 when you might have had like a pretty decent educated guess. So I still think even if you're like skipping that question to come back later, if you're taking the paper test, still make a guess, your best guess, so that if you run out of time, you're like, well, okay, I didn't get a chance to go back and look at that, but I made my best guess. Here's the deal. If you're taking the digital test on May 20th or in June, you're just going to have to police yourself, and you're going to have to like accept the fact that you are going to have to just at some point jump ship and like move on. And I think that the trick with this, so on the digital test, it's like you get question 1, it'll have your document, it'll have question 1. You go through, you're like, I think it's B, you'll click next. A thing will pop up and be like, don't forget, once you move on from this question, you cannot come back. Are you sure you want to move on? And you're like, yes. From my understanding, they'll do that once, and then they'll be like, cool, we're not going to show you that message every time, but that's your reminder. And so what that means is once you click next, even though the next question will be based on the same document, you cannot go back to question number 1. There's a whole reason for it. It's to try to prevent y'all from cheating, but whatever. So if you're taking the digital test, you need to mentally prepare yourself for the fact that there are going to be times when you're going to be like, I really think I could figure this question out, but it's going to take me like 2 or 3 more minutes. So I need to just guess and move on. And that's going to be kind of hard. I think a lot of us just psychologically really rely on feeling like, well, like I could always come back later. That makes us feel more comfortable making a guess. And taking that away, I think is going to freak some students out. Let's be honest. Most of you, every student I've ever watched take a multiple choice test, most of you don't end up going back and looking back over your answers. Like you say you're going to, and then when it's over, you're like, oh my God, I just want to turn this in and be done. And also a lot of you who do go back and look at your answers again, typically if you change it from the right answer to the wrong answer. I watch my kids do this all the time. So I honestly don't actually think it's that big of a deal that you can't go back and look at your answers, because I don't actually think most students do that, and I don't think it's actually that helpful. But psychologically, if you're taking the digital test, you need to maybe just practice this way. If you're doing practice tests, you need to like cover up and go like question 1, and you cannot move on until you answer question 1. And you can set a timer, have a watch. You're not really supposed to have your smartphone in the testing area, but you could have some sort of like get an old school watch and set up a timer for like maybe with the first one where you're having to read the stimulus too, maybe give yourself like 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. And then after that, give yourself like 1 minute per question. And if that timer goes off, then you need to just make an educated guess and move on. So that's really the biggest difference between the two. But again, even on the paper test, I really would encourage you still make a guess because you don't want to leave anything blank. Okay. Some great questions about like how to analyze a table, a graph, etc. I mean, typically if they're giving you a table or a graph, they're wanting you to notice some trend, right? I mean, so the most basic thing would be just identify like, what is the trend I'm seeing? So for example, if it's like Japan, railroad tracks from 1860 to 1910, and it's going like, they're wanting you to be like, wow, they're building a lot of railroads. Like they might give you a few different graphs and they're all trending upward. Or they might give you a chart that has like number of soldiers in South Asia from this time to this time. And you want to notice like, is it going up? Is it going down? So at its very like most basic, if they're giving you a graph, a chart, a table, just identify whatever the basic trend is, oversimplify it. This is going up, this is going down, whatever. Then the question's probably referring to something along those lines, right? By the way, on the digital test, they've told us that all the digital testers will for sure have one SAQ where they'll give you a graph or a chart or a table or something. So same idea, like literally if you want to just first identify like the trend of either up or down or bigger or smaller, then you can get a little more complicated as you go. A lot of people get really freaked out by those. They think they're more complicated than they really are. And you sort of miss the point. You're like, yeah, the whole point was just it's growing. The economy's growing, right? So I wanted to do some practice and I wanted to walk you through my strategy with a few practice questions. So feel free to like play along at home. I'm on a little bit of a delay. So like, I don't think I'll be able to like wait for everyone to put in their guesses, but maybe like work through it on your own as well. So these questions come from the CED, the course and exam description. So some of you might have seen some of these before, your teachers might have used these, but these are ones the College Board has given us as like, hey, here are some examples of what a multiple choice question might look like. So here you get a map. So you get two maps actually, awesome. I still would wait and I would like skim through the first question first, just so you can kind of see what you're supposed to be noticing about these maps. So this one says, which of the following historical developments, by the way, historical development is just AP language for thing that happened in the past. My students are always like, what's a historical development? It sounds very fancy. It's literally the fancy word for thing. Which of the following things that happened most strongly contributed to the map maker's depiction of West Africa and the southern half of the world in map 2? This is why it's helpful to read the question first, because they're like telling us you only have to look at one specific part of one map. So we're looking at map 2 only, and we're just looking at West Africa here and the southern half of the world. So there's like this, okay, and you're like, okay, it's like a little funky, but it's getting there, right? I mean, we know you can get around Africa at least. That's kind of cool. We weren't sure about that before. Okay, so you're like, the west coast of Africa is actually pretty good. It looks pretty close. The southern half is a little funky, but it's not crazy, right? I mean, it's like, it looks okay. So which of the following things most strongly contributed to how the map maker is depicting West Africa and the southern half of the world? So you want to think about, well, how is the map maker depicting West Africa and the southern half of the world? It's like, it's not perfect, but it's becoming closer to what we know the map looks like today. So first you want to go through and eliminate anything where you're like, this is just wrong or just has nothing to do with the question. Portugal's development of maritime technology and navigational skills. Okay, that could help. I know Portugal did a lot of this map making, so I'm going to keep that. China's naval expeditions in the Indian Ocean basin. I know China did that earlier on, but this is a map by a European, so like, what does China have to do with that? I'm going to cross that one out. The limited geographic knowledge of Western European map makers as a result of the region's commercial isolation. I know that happened at one point too, and that would sort of relate, so I'm going to leave that one. The decline of powers such as Genoa and Venice, the rise of England, France, and the Netherlands. No, I mean, this is an Italian map maker, and also, how would that tell us anything about the map? So notice I got down to the two that are specifically about map making. Like, I know it seems really obvious, but like, they didn't give you a map on accident, right? And notice I'm actually down to 2 that are the opposite of each other. This is tricky, right? It's like, well, Portugal is becoming more technologically advanced and developing more skills in navigation. I know that's a trend that's occurring. I also know that at some point, Western Europeans were relatively isolated and didn't have great geographic knowledge. So what I really want to ask myself then is like, is this a map that's showing that they're growing in their skills or that they're completely backwards in their skills? And to me, I'm like, you know what? It's not perfect, but it's pretty close, right? I mean, they figured out you can get around Africa. Like India is starting to look more like India. So I'm going to go with A. Right? I know both A and C are correct statements. And I also am like, you know what, even though this map isn't exactly the way I know it is, like it's not what it used to be. Was like Africa just went on forever and like they didn't know if you could ever get around it, that sort of thing. Right? So yeah, the answer is A. I think this is a tricky one, right? Because I think, you know, this one could be true if this map were a little bit older. So again, I think eliminating and getting down to 2 is really helpful. I also think that if I was stuck between A and C still, which it looks like a lot of you are, then I would go back to the document and be like, okay, well, this document is from the early 1400s, 1492, that sort of thing. So which of these answer choices more closely relates to this era? Which this era is the era of like Portugal going out and exploring, and like this is Vasco da Gama getting around Africa. So if this were a map from like the Middle Ages, then this answer would maybe make more sense. But because the map they've given us is from this kind of early modern era, that's a clue that I'm supposed to be like, yeah, they are becoming more advanced. So again, that's how you can kind of work through those strategies. I also want you to notice how A is more vague than C. C says like limited knowledge of Western European map makers, the region's commercial isolation. That's like 3 very specific things. Whereas A is just being like, yeah, the Portuguese are becoming more advanced in terms of technology and skills. And like, we know that's true. Okay, cool. Obviously on the test, I wouldn't expect you to spend that much time on one question, but I just want us to walk through so you can kind of see how I would approach these. All right. So look at question number 2. This one should go a little more quickly because we've already looked at part of the source. So now we see a historian would most likely use map number 1. Okay, now we're gonna have to look at this map, right? To research which of the following developments in this time period. So you're like, oh wow, a historian like today could use this map to research which thing. And so let's look at what this map is, right? It's a map around the same time. It's around 1489. It's by an Italian guy, and it's just of the Mediterranean. So make sure that you read the source information. Someone mentioned in the chat, like the source information is so helpful. Do not skip that. It shows a number of cities and places, including all these Italian city-states, Paris, Muslim Emirate, several cities. And I notice it's just of the Mediterranean, and I'm also noticing it's really good. This is like a really accurate map of, right, like the Mediterranean region. And again, they're telling us it has a lot of like cities and important places along these. Okay, so if I'm a historian today in 2021 and I find this map, it would be helpful for me to figure out what. So first I'm going to eliminate anything that makes no sense. The efforts of wealthy Renaissance patrons to encourage the fine arts and scientific research. I'm going to keep it for now because like I know that happened and scientific research could be map making, but that doesn't seem to make sense. The ways that European cartography, which is map making, that's a nice clue, drew on earlier knowledge from the Islamic world, that could make sense. The influence of the Crusades against the Ottoman Empire on the commercial expansion, no. I mean, that's, again, that is a true statement, but it doesn't have anything, this map isn't showing anything about expansion or decline, it's just showing like what's there. Consolidation of the Russian Empire, no. Sorry. Okay, so now I'm down to these 2. And you notice, like, one of them I was like, maybe. But then one of them I was like, well, that definitely happened. And it literally has the word cartography in it. So again, if you're not sure, it's showing you a map. And then this one is specifically about map making. And this also makes sense because the source information told us that there are also a lot of cities from the Muslim Emirates, right? These Islamic empires. So it makes sense that an Italian map maker would also include a lot of those because they might be like looking at an older map that the Muslims made and then adding in like European places. So yeah, the answer is B, right? So again, you know, all 4 of these statements are true. The last one for sure doesn't relate to the prompt. This one is from this region, but has really nothing to do with the map making skills. I could make an argument for A. I could be like, well, wealthy Renaissance patrons would encourage scientists, and some scientists might eventually discover places and make maps. But notice I have to make like a lot of leaps to get from that to the answer, whereas this one's pretty direct, right? So most likely, most directly, it's like you want to have to do as little explaining as possible to get from the question to the answer. Great, so the answer is B. All right, last one. Which of the following factors would most contribute to future revisions of map 2? Okay, so now we're like going to predict the future a little bit. That's fun, College Board. So what they're saying is like, okay, in the future, what's going to change about this map? Well, a few things are going to change. One is like this thing of Africa will probably get a little bit better. And same with like India will get better, that sort of thing. There's also like a whole 2 continents missing from this map. So I've kind of predicted some changes, some ways they might need to update this map later on. So Western Europeans discovered geographical scholarship from the Mongols. Nope, they did not really do that. The experiences of European merchants transporting Asian goods in the Indian Ocean. That could make sense. They could get a better understanding of what the Indian Ocean region looks like. Spanish sponsorship of transatlantic and trans-Pacific exploration, that also could make sense. Qing's resumption of expeditions, no, that does not happen. Okay, so I'm down to these 2. And both of these could make sense to me, right? Both of these could be like, well, yeah, European merchants, they are going to get more involved in the Indian Ocean trade. And that could lead to like these coastlines getting a little bit better. And also the Spanish are going to sponsor exploration across the Atlantic and then eventually across the Pacific. So really my question is like, which of the following is going to contribute most? Here's a perfect example of a tricky AP question. These both will contribute. The map will get better because of both of these developments. Which one is going to change the map more? It's the discovery of like 2 whole continents. That's going to contribute more to future revisions, right? Because it's like, okay, yeah, B is going to lead to like these coastlines getting a little bit better, but like C is going to add a whole other part of this map, right? It's going to be like, oh wait, we forgot about 2 entire continents. So this is one of those annoying examples where you're like, there's a right answer and there's a righter answer. And you want to pick the rightest answer, right? So you want to go back and see words like most directly, whatever. And so the answer is C, because this is clearly going to have a bigger, more dramatic impact on this map of the world. So here's one thing I will say. If you're going through these and you're getting down to the 2 I'm getting down to and then guessing wrong, don't freak out. Honestly, if you are on average getting down to the 2 answer choices that are the most reasonable, then you're doing fine. Because remember, you don't have to get a perfect score. You know, if you're literally picking every time the one that I'm like, no, it's definitely not that, then you probably want to go back and study more of just the content. But if you are getting it down to the 2 kind of most right ones, that means you kind of know your content. You have a pretty good idea of what this is about. You now just need to practice. You need to look at as many multiple choice questions as possible because you will start to get used to how to identify like, okay, this one's more right than this other one. So, okay. I'm deciding between doing, I have one other set of examples, but I want to talk about pacing for the rest of the test. And then if we have time, we can go back. So I want to move on to the short answer question. We're not going to spend as much time here because I've already done some YouTubes on this and I think it's a little bit more straightforward. But every one paper or digital test is then going to have an SAQ section. It will be separate. So you will do your multiple choice section. You will submit that. If it's on paper, you will turn in that part. Then time will run out, so you can't move forward. You can't, like, if you finish the multiple choice early, that doesn't give you more time on any other section. You just have to sit there and wait. So you might as well go back and make sure you have guesses for every answer. Then you'll get the SAQ. Again, if you're doing it on paper, you'll get all of the SAQs and you can answer them in kind of whatever order you want. If you're doing on the digital test, you'll get an SAQ with like A, B, and C. So you can answer those in whatever order you want, but you have to submit before you can go see the next one. Okay, so the pacing. The biggest problem that I see students, the biggest mistake students will make is they just run out of time on the short answer question. They forget about the S, the short part of short answer question. For the most part, when I'm grading SAQs, I find the answer within the first 2 sentences, and then I skim. So if you're writing more than 4 sentences, you're writing too much. Like if you're not clearly answering the question and supporting it within 2 or 3 sentences, you're not really answering the question, right? And so focus on the word short. There's no bonus points. Literally each short answer question is like you either get the point or you don't. There's no bonus. There's no like complexity. It's like, do you do it? And so only answer what the question is asking you. So if it says just to identify a thing, then just identify a thing. Identify one specific thing and move on. So if it says identify one new state that rose along networks of exchange, then what that literally means is you'll just say, and you don't have to restate the whole thing. You can just say, one state was the Sultanate of Malacca in Southeast Asia. Or if it's like along networks of exchange, maybe I'd say like in the Indian Ocean. That's it. And then I move on. Or, right, one state was Mali. I've identified the state. I kind of want to maybe identify the trade route on the Saharan trade. That's literally it. It's one sentence. If they just tell you identify, just clearly identify. You have to be specific enough. You can't be like, one was China. It's like, what? Like what do you mean? China's always been a thing. But you could say one was the Yuan dynasty along the Silk Road. Like the Chinese when the Mongols ruled them, whatever, right? That's it. That's all you have to do. Now, if they say anything other than identify, then you need to have more than one sentence. Anything other than just identify, if they say identify and explain or explain, describe, any of those other words, treat them all kind of the same, and you're going to need to have more than one answer. You'll want to explain more of why this thing proves it. So if they say explain one way that traditional labor systems change between 1450 and 1750, you still do the first part. You still just like answer the question, right? So you say like, one change to labor systems was the rise of chattel slavery. So you're still doing the first part. You're just like identifying a change. Now you're going to explain like how that change occurred or why it was a big change from earlier eras. So you might say like previously slavery or enslaved people were still considered human beings with some basic rights. However, in the Atlantic slave system, I'm going to move over here, slave owners treated their enslaved people as property. And then you move on. So like you've still identified a specific change, but now you're explaining. And if you're not sure what to explain, just ask yourself either how or why. Right? How or why. So if you're like, one change was the rise of chattel slavery, how or why did that thing happen? Explain that and then move on. That's a really good question. So the question is like, if you're taking the digital test and you're like taking it at your home, what's to stop you from having all your notes out? So like, we actually don't know. We do know that they're not going to use your camera to like record you while you're taking the test. We do know that they are doing their best to kind of monitor, like when you have the digital thing pulled up, it locks your screen. So you can't be on other apps and stuff in your computer. But like the question is, what's to keep you from just having your book out? Well, one is just like your own moral compass, which is like you shouldn't be cheating your way into college credit. That's not going to help you out later. But that some people are like, who cares about morality? So if you're one of those people, it's time. It's like, I honestly think it's a disadvantage because I think if you're sitting there and you really think like, great, I'll just have my book and like, I'll just go look up all the answers in my book. You're going to run out of time. You're going to 100% run out of time. You're going to spend so much time going through your notes or whatever and trying to figure out the answer that you're going to end up not answering some of the questions. So I think it's like It's a mirage. It's like fool's gold. It seemed like, I think there are a lot of students out there that are like, oh, great, I'll just have my notes out or whatever. And like, one, if the College Board finds out you did that, they will like not send any of your scores, including SAT scores and stuff, to colleges. Like, colleges are going to know. So like, I wouldn't piss off the College Board, but that's just me. But even if they don't find out, I honestly think it's going to hurt you, because this test is about going fast. And so if you're relying on any sort of outside source, again, one, is not allowed, but two, I actually think it's going to make you do worse on the test. And I'm sure some students will do it, and I think they're gonna struggle because they're gonna run out of time trying to find information. So that's my take on that. That's genuinely how I feel. Like, I totally understand there are probably students out there who are like thinking they can be really sneaky. I actually think it's gonna come back to like bite them, but who am I? I'm just someone who's been teaching this class for 10 years. I've seen it, and I've seen it that typically if students feel like they can rely on outside sources and stuff, it ends up hurting them more than it helps them. Okay. So here's my one strategy that's slightly different, depending on if you're taking the paper or the digital test. If you're taking the paper test, what I would do is I would skim all 3 of the short answer questions and like start with the ones that come the easiest to you. Because remember, all of these parts are the same amount of points. So like this question of like identify one thing, blah, 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 is worth 1 point, just like this one is. So I think it's in your best interest to skim through, and you can like answer the ones that like you can answer pretty quickly first. Make sure you get those easier points, then go back to the ones where you're like, I'm gonna have to think about this one for a few minutes. So on the test, on the paper test, they give you like 1 page for each SAQ. And so you could have like, okay, SAQ 1, 2, and 3, and you can actually kind of jump around. You can say like, okay, I'm gonna go answer A for this one, because that one I immediately can think of a good answer. Get that one out of the way. You can kind of jump around if you want to. On the digital test, you can still do that, but not quite as much. So on the digital test, you'll get an SAQ that's going to have the 3 parts. I still would answer those in the order of like the easiest one first. So again, you're going to get a text box where you're going to answer all 3 of them. So you'll literally just put like A and then answer your question. So you can do like B first. If you skim through the 3 and you're like, okay, I have a good idea for B, get that one out of the way, get it out of your brain, and then work your way down to the ones that are harder. Because again, each one is worth the same point. So again, I like to tell my students, like, I'm going to date myself, but imagine that you're like Mario, Super Mario Brothers, and you're like going through and there's all these gold coins, and some of them are higher than others and some are lower. Like, they're all worth the same thing. Make sure that you're at least grabbing as many of those easy points as possible, right? And leave the ones that you might struggle with anyway to the end. Because you're like, well, I might just not have gotten this one right anyway. I could have spent 30 minutes on it and still gotten it wrong. So leave that one to the end. So Kirthana, to your question, how much time would you say we should take on each SAQ? So overall, it's like you have, if you have 3 SAQs in 40 minutes, that works out to around 13 minutes per SAQ. And so I would say, like, let's say 3 to 5 minutes per part on average. And again, some of them will come fast, right? I mean, you might get this one, and like this might take you 1 minute. You're like, one state was Malacca in the Indian Ocean, and then you move on, and now you maybe need to spend a little more time on this one. But on average, if for each little part, A, B, C, you're somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, then you're on track. So again, if you're taking the digital exam, you can have a watch set up or whatever, where you can actually maybe set a timer for 4 minutes. And then if you're stuck and it's 4 minutes and you still haven't written anything, be like, okay, I just got to put an idea down and like move on to the next one. And I'll come back if I have time before I submit this whole SAQ. So again, just answer the question it's asking and no more, right? You have to identify something specific, right? So like you have to think about every SAQ should have some specific evidence, whether that's a proper noun, something you would capitalize, the Sultanate of Malacca or whatever. Or it should have what I think of as like a key word. Think about it in your textbook. What would be a term that would be bold in your textbook? It needs to have something like that, because honestly, like when we're grading these, we don't know you. Like we don't know you individually. And so we as teachers are just trying to figure out, are you BSing your way through this, or do you really know what you're talking about? And the way you can make us know that you know what you're talking about is to name something specific. Because you'd be surprised how many people will be like, one state was the rise of trading city-states along the ocean. States along oceans would trade with other ocean states. And I'm like, yeah, like all that stuff is true, but like I kind of feel like you're just BSing. And if you then literally just said like, one state was the Swahili city-states along the coast of Africa. That's it. That's all you got to say. And I'm like, great. I trust you. You know what you're talking about, right? Okay. Yeah, and Brooks, to your question, if you say something that's wrong, it doesn't count off. It just doesn't count for you. So let's say you say something like, one state was the Sultanate of, I'm trying to make up a thing that's not true. The Sultanate of Mesopotamia in the Indian Ocean, right? We're like, no, that wasn't a thing. So you probably like won't get that point because that's wrong, but it's not gonna like take away points you've already gotten, right? Or, you know, let's say you say part of it that's wrong, but then later you say something right. So let's say you're answering one of these explain questions and you start off with something kind of wrong and you're like, one change was that, states in the Americas only relied on slavery. And you're like, well, that's not true. But if you keep going and you're saying like, the reason for this was because they had used indigenous labor and indentured servitude, but there were rebellions, so they switched to slavery. I'm like, well, actually, the rest of that is pretty good. The rest of that's pretty true. So I'm like, well, the question you want to ask is like, if you say something that's just factually untrue, what you want to think about is like, as a grader, I'm like, okay, if I just eliminated that sentence that's false, like that's not true. But then I read this and I'm like, if your answer was just they had used indigenous labor, indentured servitude, but they were rebellions, so they switched, does that still answer the question? Yeah, it does. So you'd still get the point because I can like delete the wrong thing and you still have enough, right? Okay, how do you know the answer? You got to study. I mean, there's nothing, like I can't, you know, there's no trick for just like knowing a state. What I would say is this is where the Marco Learning Study Guide is helpful because they know this course inside and out. And so they're going to be giving you like the big ideas. So if you get the Marco Learning Study Guide, again, it's free for Unit 1 and 2, there's going to be a section on like new states rising along trade routes. You also can use the, if you go Google AP World course and exam description, that is like the teacher key of like, here are all the main ideas that you need to know. Now it's dense. And so you want to kind of skim through it, but that'll also give you some of these statements. They'll be like, hey, one learning objective is, can you explain how states rose along networks of exchange? So at the end of the day, you do just have to know stuff. I can only give you so many tricks, right? So who's not, you're asking about a lot of teachers, which I love this. They teach for the SAQ a thing. I call it ACE. People kind of call it different things. So they'd say like, answer the question, prove it or cite a specific piece of evidence, and then explain. That is like a complete SAQ. That's in an ideal world. So what I like to say is like, if you are getting an identify, if they just say identify only, then you only have to do this first part. You answer it and then cite a specific piece of evidence. One state that rose was Malacca on the Indian Ocean. You've answered and you've cited a specific piece. Then any other question, if they do anything other than just identify, yeah, you're doing this whole thing, right? So again, that's kind of what I did on that example. I said like, one change was the rise of chattel slavery on, let's say, American plantations. Already I've answered the question and I've cited something specific, chattel slavery on American plantations. Now all I have to do is explain how or why that change happened, right? So again, that's where on strategy, on the day of the test, pay attention. If the question literally just says identify one, you don't have to explain it. I'm scoring you, and if I see one state was Malacca in the Indian Ocean, I stop reading. I'm like, you got the point, and I move on. So don't waste your time with like a huge explanation if you don't need to have one. Okay. All right. So then you get a little break. I don't think it's very long. Maybe John could put in the chat. Do we know how long the break is between these two? I can't remember. It's like maybe 5 or 10 minutes. It's not very long. And then you get your last chunk, which is the full writing section. And so you're going to get one big chunk of time. No, spelling does not count at all. There's no points for spelling, for grammar, for it sounding nice. Do not use metaphors. This is not creative writing. Oh, you get 20-minute break on the digital exam. That's nicer than I thought. My kids are going to be very excited about that. Some of my kids will probably take a nap. That's going to be bad. So for spelling and that sort of thing, no. As long as we can tell what you mean. So if you said like one state was the Sultanate of... Let's go really crazy. In the Indian Ocean. Let's say you wrote that, I'd probably still give you the point. That's why like including as much detail as possible is great. Because like, okay, the Sultanate of Makalla is not a thing, but I think you're talking about the Sultanate of Malacca. And then you said in the Indian Ocean. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I know what you mean, right? So again, if it's just like, yeah, you got a little mixed up or like you spelled it wrong or something like that, as long as I can tell what you mean, you're okay. And same thing for grammar and stuff. Now, the only thing is everything has to be in complete sentences. So you cannot do bullet points. You cannot just be like Sultanate of Malacca in the Indian Ocean. We will only grade something that's in a complete sentence. So just keep that in mind, that there are some students who want to just race through and they just do bullet points. And unfortunately, we just can't really even look at it, right? So, okay. So you get this big chunk. They encourage you. You will all have a DBQ. That's the first thing you will do, or you should do. On the LEQ, in theory, you can go back and forth, but I would do the DBQ first because it's worth way more points. And you should spend around an hour on the DBQ, give or take. And then you should spend around 40 minutes on whatever's left. So if you're taking the paper test, that's an LEQ, just like a regular essay. And if you're taking the digital test, that's 2 more short answer questions. Here's what I will say. I always encourage my students, like, you should take a little bit of time from that for the DBQ. I really think the DBQ, you should spend like, let's say 70 minutes maximum. So an hour and 10 minutes. And then that leaves you like 30 minutes for these, which to me is plenty of time because the DBQ is worth way more than this other part. The DBQ is worth 25% of your score. I had to think about that for a second. And then the LEQ or other SAQs are only worth 15%. So do not like, you definitely should be spending more time on the second part. Okay. Here's the strategy for the DBQ. Deep breath. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. And then like John said, you can literally go watch me do this on my YouTube channel. I literally a few days ago posted a video of me doing this live where you can watch me skim through the documents. You can watch me like figure out how to apply them. So for today, as far as pacing goes, I just want to explain to you my strategy and how I think it will work on either the paper or the digital test. And then if you want to see it in practice, you can go watch me do that on my YouTube channel. Okay. So I think the first step on either a DBQ or an LEQ is that you make sure you really understand what the prompt is asking before you start looking at the documents. What I encourage my students to do is break the prompt into keywords, meaning if you were going to go try to Google and find this prompt later, what words would you Google? And so let's look at an example so I can kind of show you what I mean by that. Let's say you had this DBQ prompt. The keywords would be evaluate the extent to which the experience of the First World War, that's something specific, changed, that's what I'm focusing on, relationships between Europeans and colonized people. Oh, good. I'm so glad. So the keywords are like The First World War changed the relationship, Europeans and colonized people. Great. That's what I'm looking for. The reason why you should identify those keywords up front is for a few reasons, but most of which it's going to be this will help you skim the documents more quickly. So if we're talking about pacing, because now what that means is like you know exactly what you're looking for. You are just looking for anything in the document that tells you about a changing relationship between these two groups. Everything else is fluff. Everything else you skim. So if I'm then going to go start skimming the documents, like we can look at one example, right? Then I know, like, I'm going to first read fully the source information. This is a native of a British African colony. He's a Baptist minister. It's something he's publishing right at the beginning of the World War. Okay, and now I'm just looking for, he is a colonized person. So what is his relationship to Europeans? That's it. I'm skimming everything else, and I'm only going to stop and read carefully when I see something that gives me an idea of what he thinks about Europeans. We've invited innocent blood in the past, Africa. We find that the poor African has been plunged. We're ready, ignorant. We have been loyal since the beginning of the British government. Blah, blah, blah. The British would have been incomplete without our loyalty. The government failed to help the underdog. Everything was for Europeans only. Now we're needed. Okay, I get what I need. He's mad. He's pissed. He's like, you haven't done really enough for us in peacetime, and now in war you're telling us, we need all of you. You're so important. You have to go fight and die for us. So again, for this one, I'd be like, great. The relationship is that colonized people are getting mad at the Europeans because of the World War. And then I would move on. And so I want you to notice, like, I'm skimming. All of this is like bloodshed, war, blah, okay, uniforms. And only when I get to him talking about the Europeans do I stop and read. Because I'm like, that's what I'm looking for, because that's what the prompt has told me. So this is one way that you can get through the documents more quickly, is just make sure that you're really clear about what you're looking for, and the prompt will tell you what you're looking for. There's going to be some fluff in the documents that, like, you don't necessarily have to understand completely. So what I would do is I would skim through all the documents, just getting the basic idea. So if they're asking about the relationship between Europeans and colonized people, I'd first be like, is it good or bad? So that first document is like, ooh, bad. Colonized people are mad at Europeans. The only other thing I'm going to do is if I notice a source that might be interesting to analyze later, I might make a little note of it to remind myself. So if you go watch me write the DBQ, you'll see every once in a while I'll go, ooh, this is kind of an interesting point of view. If I have time, I might talk about this point of view later. But I don't worry about that right now. Some of your teachers might have been having you trained to like hip every document. That's to practice. Do not do that on the AP exam, right? So don't do that on the AP exam. That's going to waste a lot of your time. I would like make a note of like, hey, if I have time, I might go back and evaluate this point of view, but that's not the first thing I'm going to do, right? Then what I would do is get my basic essay done. Like if I skim through the 7, I at least need to use 3 or 4 documents. I do 4 just to be safe. Ideally, if I can apply 6 of the documents, great. And what I would do is get my basic essay written. This also helps with people who panic and are like stuck. And you're like just staring at a blank page and you're like, oh my God, it's the AP exam. What do I do? So if nothing else, you can like kind of group your documents. You can sort your documents based on the tone if that helps answer the question. You know what I mean? So for this essay, I think, yeah, because this tone is really negative. The colonized people are really angry at the British. And then you might find others that are a different tone. But I think it just depends on what the question's asking. I would not sort documents just based on like, these are speeches and these are letters. Like that's not helpful. I would sort them more based on an answer. So for this answer, it might be like, the changing relationship was Europeans realized they needed colonized people and colonized people felt more resentful of Europeans. And those are my 2 groups. It could be, so something that's a little more specific to the answer. Then once I have my basic essay down, then I would go back and add in all those extra things, try to hip the documents, add in context, add in additional evidence until I ran out of time. That's how I would pace it. If you're writing on the paper exam, you can leave space, or you can just do an arrow and be like, okay, I'm going to add this part in, read this part here. If you're typing, that's where I think you have an advantage, is that you can just go put your cursor and like, right? So Kirthana, yeah, you need to use 6 documents for the second document point. So it's like, it depends on how comfortable you are with the DBQ. At the very least, I would use 3 or 4 documents to get that 1 point. If you feel more comfortable, then I would go ahead and use all of them in your first go. Here's what I'm going to end with. Worst case scenario, you are panicking, you get stuck, you're staring at the DBQ, you have a blank piece of paper, and you're freaking out. You're totally stuck. Just start addressing each document on its own. You don't actually have to group the documents. There's no point for grouping them. It's good to, but you don't have to. So if you get totally stuck and you're panicked, just start being like, document 1 is a colonized person who is mad at the Europeans for making them fight. Document 2 is a blah, blah, blah. Just start putting them in your own words, and that will get your brain going. And you'll at least get a point for addressing 3 documents. And then hopefully once you get going, you'll start to be like, oh, I see now. I can start to kind of make a thesis or whatever. So if nothing else, my big takeaway is like, get something down on the page, get started. And then a lot of times the ideas come, like you might have to start writing and then you go, oh, now I understand what I'm going to argue, right? And then you might go back and like write your thesis or make it better later or whatever. Whoa, we made it through the whole test, y'all. Oh my gosh. Okay. So here's what you should do now. Make sure that you're following us on social media. Make sure that you go check out those videos of John grading my DBQ if you want to see how graders approach it. And then John, what else do we have? We have some other, I think the day before the test, we're going to be doing some stuff on Instagram, I think.
That's right. So we're packing the Marco Learning. We'll go live. Actually, we can go live on both of our accounts, Anti-Social Studies on Instagram and Marco Learning. Definitely be in the loop with us. We're going to be very, very busy over the next few days. In fact, we're going to be busy in the next 2 minutes because we're going to be doing an AP biology review right here on this channel. So stay in touch with Emily at Anti-Social Studies with Marco Learning. We're going to help you guys out. Thank you so much, Emily. This was really helpful.